I watch through the auction house window as Helena holds up my grandmother's emerald necklace, the one that's been in the Chen family for 4 generations. And I realize this is the moment I truly have nothing left. Nothing but the medical bills that will kill me within the month and the knowledge that my father, Richard Chen's new wife, has successfully stolen everything that should have been mine. The emeralds catch the light as she speaks to the auctioneer, her perfectly manicured fingers touching the stones that my great-grandmother wore to her wedding in Shanghai, that my grandmother treasured through the war, that my mother wore on the night she met my father. And now, Helena Morrison Chen treats them like just another commodity to liquidate for her precious daughter Madison's wedding fund. The bidding starts at $50,000, and I feel each increment like a physical blow to my chest, watching strangers compete for the last tangible connection I have to the women who came before me. The women who built the Chen family legacy that Helena has systematically dismantled piece by piece over the past 6 years since she married my grieving father and convinced him that his only daughter was ungrateful, unstable, and unworthy of the inheritance that should have been my birthright. 60,000, 70,000, and still climbing while I stand in my threadbare coat outside the auction house because I can't even afford the registration fee to bid on my own family's treasures, reduced to watching through glass like some desperate stalker, while Helena transforms my heritage into cash for her social climbing schemes. The hammer falls at $95,000, and I see Helena's satisfied smile as she shakes hands with the successful bidder, an elderly woman in pearls who will never know that she just purchased a piece of my soul. And I remember how Helena first approached my father at Mother's funeral, how she positioned herself as the grieving widow who understood his pain since she, too, had lost her spouse, how she brought her teenage daughter Madison around more and more until Father started seeing them as the family that could heal his broken heart. I was only 20 then, too consumed with my own grief to recognize the calculating predator who saw opportunity in our tragedy, who studied our family dynamics with the precision of a military strategist planning a conquest that would span years and leave no survivors except her own bloodline. The irony burns in my throat as I realize that Helena used my own jewelry collection as collateral for what she called family business emergencies over the years, convincing Father that a loving daughter would sacrifice for the greater good, that my mother's wedding ring was just sitting in a vault earning nothing while the family company needed capital, that my grandmother's pearl choker was selfish sentimentality when Madison needed a proper debut necklace for society events. Each piece disappeared with promises of temporary loans and strategic investments, with Helena's tears of gratitude and Father's proud speeches about my generous spirit, until I woke up one day to discover that I owned nothing but the cheap replacement jewelry Helena had substituted when she thought I wouldn't notice the difference. But I did notice, just too late to do anything about it. Too late to save the diamond tennis bracelet that Mother wore every day. Too late to protect the ruby earrings that were my 16th birthday gift from grandmother before she died. Too late to prevent Helena from convincing Father that his daughter's attachment to old things was preventing her from embracing her new family and moving forward with her life. The medical diagnosis came 6 months ago, terminal illness that insurance won't cover, because Helena had systematically removed me from family policies, claiming I was an adult who should manage my own health care. And now I have maybe 4 weeks left to live while Helena sells the last vestiges of my existence to fund her daughter's fairy tale wedding to my former fiancé, Lucas Way. The systematic destruction of my life began so gradually that I didn't recognize it as warfare until Helena had already won every major battle, starting with her whispered concerns to Father about my emotional instability after Mother's death, how I needed guidance and supervision to make good decisions, how my independence was really just stubbornness that would hurt me in the long run if left unchecked. She documented every moment of normal grief as evidence of mental fragility, every tear as proof that I couldn't handle adult responsibilities, every question about our changing family dynamic as ungrateful rebellion that showed I didn't appreciate the love and support she was trying to provide as my new mother figure. Helena convinced Father to add her name to every account and property deed for my own protection, she said, so that someone stable could manage things if I had another episode, like the panic attack I experienced when I found Mother's wedding dress donated to charity without my knowledge, or the breakdown I suffered when I discovered our family photos had been replaced with new portraits featuring Helena and Madison prominently, while I was pushed to the margins like some distant relative visiting for the holidays. Madison married my former fiancé, Lucas Way, 6 months ago. After spending 2 years systematically sabotaging our relationship with carefully planted seeds of doubt about my character, my stability, my suitability as a wife for a prominent businessman's son, until Lucas started seeing me through Helena's distorted lens and found me lacking compared to Madison's practiced sweetness and strategic vulnerability. I lost my position in Chen Enterprises to Madison when Helena convinced father that his daughter lacked the emotional maturity for business leadership, while her daughter had studied business management specifically to help our family company grow and prosper, and I watched from the sidelines as Madison implemented policies I had suggested years earlier, taking credit for my innovations while I was relegated to meaningless administrative tasks that gradually disappeared entirely until I was simply no longer needed at the company my grandfather built from nothing. Helena sold our family properties one by one for what she called strategic downsizing, claiming the real estate market was perfect for liquidating assets that were just draining resources through maintenance and taxes, while she moved us into smaller and smaller homes, until I was finally living in a studio apartment that Helena graciously allowed me to rent from her at market rates. The medical diagnosis came like a final cruel joke from the universe. Terminal illness that required expensive treatment I couldn't afford because Helena had arranged for me to be removed from the family health insurance when I turned 25, claiming it was time for me to take responsibility for my own life and stop depending on father's generosity for everything. Helena sold my mother's jewelry piece by piece over the years, each time with tearful explanations about family emergencies that required immediate cash, about opportunities that couldn't wait for traditional financing, about my selfish hoarding of material possessions when the family needed my support to survive and thrive in challenging economic times. I discovered Helena had been forging father's signature for years when I found the documents in her study while searching for aspirin during one of my increasingly frequent episodes of weakness. And I realized that father might not have authorized half of the financial decisions that had stripped away my inheritance and left me with nothing but debt and medical bills that I could never pay. The bank statements showed systematic transfers from accounts that should have been protected trusts into Helena's personal holdings, property sales that happened without family meetings or discussions, investment liquidations that transformed generational wealth into Madison's wedding fund, and Helena's shopping sprees and charity donations that bought her social standing among the city's elite families. But by then, I was too sick to fight, too weak to hire lawyers or challenge Helena's machinations, too isolated from former friends and allies who had been systematically poisoned against me through Helena's careful campaign of character assassination and social manipulation. Until I was truly alone with my dying body and the knowledge that I had been completely outmaneuvered by a woman who saw my family's grief as an opportunity for advancement and my father's love as a tool for her own enrichment. I spent my final weeks in that studio apartment, watching Helena and Madison live in luxury built on my mother's legacy, while I counted pills and calculated how many days I had left before the pain became unbearable and the choice would be made for me. The collapse comes on a Tuesday morning when I'm trying to make tea with hands that shake so badly I can barely hold the kettle, and I feel my legs give out as the room spins around me in slow motion, while I think about childhood friend David Zhang, who tried to warn me about Helena's manipulations 3 years ago, who told me she was researching our family's financial records and asking questions that seemed designed to map our vulnerabilities rather than understand our business operations. I should have listened to David when he said Helena's interest in our family felt calculated rather than romantic, when he pointed out the convenient timing of her appearance in father's life, when he offered to hire private investigators to verify her background story about being a widow from a respectable family who needed a fresh start after her husband's tragic accident. But I was so desperate for father to be happy again, so guilty about my own grief consuming his attention when he needed to heal and move forward, so eager to believe that Helena could give him the companionship and joy that I couldn't provide in my own shattered state, that I dismissed David's concerns as jealousy or paranoia and accused him of trying to sabotage father's chance at finding love again after years of loneliness and sorrow. I pushed away the one person who actually saw Helena's true nature, who understood that her tears and devotion were performances designed to manipulate father's protective instincts and transform his grief into gratitude for her timely rescue from despair and isolation. David tried to maintain our friendship even after I refused to listen to his warnings about Helena, sending flowers on my birthday when Helena forgot, calling to check on my health when father was too busy with business trips and romantic dinners to notice my increasing weakness, offering financial help when my medical bills started accumulating and my access to family resources mysteriously became complicated by paperwork and approval processes that Helena managed with careful attention to detail and timing. I was too proud to accept David's assistance, too convinced that I should solve my own problems, rather than burden the childhood friend who had already sacrificed enough of his time and energy trying to save me from disasters I couldn't even recognize as deliberate attacks, rather than unfortunate circumstances. The regret burns in my chest as my vision fades and I think about all the moments when I chose Helena's false comfort over David's honest concern, when I believed her tears over his evidence, when I trusted her promises over his warnings, and I realized that I'm dying alone because I systematically rejected everyone who tried to help me while embracing the woman who orchestrated my destruction with methodical precision and infinite patience. My last coherent thought is wondering what my life might have looked like if I had trusted the people who actually loved me instead of the ones who saw me as an obstacle to their ambitions. If I had valued loyalty over convenience and truth over the comfortable lies that Helena fed my desperate need to believe that our family could be whole again. The darkness takes me while I'm still holding the cold teacup, still thinking about David's face when I told him to stop interfering in my family's happiness, still regretting every choice that led me to die in poverty while Helena lived in luxury built on my mother's legacy and my father's manipulated affections. Then I opened my eyes and realized I had been reborn. And the first thing I see is my reflection in the mirror of my childhood bedroom, the same bedroom in the Chen family mansion that Helena would eventually claim for Madison. And I know exactly what day this is because I remember the conversation I'm about to have with father about letting Helena borrow mother's diamond tennis bracelet for a charity gala, where she wants to make a good impression on the other philanthropist wives who could become valuable social connections for our family's business interests. The awareness hits me like lightning as I stare at my 22-year-old face in the mirror. My skin healthy and glowing without the pallor of terminal illness. My hair thick and lustrous instead of brittle from medical treatments I couldn't afford. My eyes bright with life instead of dulled by pain and despair. And I realize I have returned to the exact moment when Helena first successfully manipulated me into giving up a piece of my mother's jewelry collection. This is 6 months after father's remarriage to Helena Morrison. 6 months into the systematic campaign that will eventually strip away everything I inherited from the women who came before me. And I remember with perfect clarity how eager I was to please my new stepmother, how desperately I wanted to prove that I could be a loving daughter to the woman who claimed she wanted nothing more than to honor my mother's memory while caring for our family. In my previous life, when Helena knocked on my bedroom door with tears in her eyes and explained that she had been invited to chair a major charity gala but didn't have appropriate jewelry to wear with her formal gown, I immediately offered to let her borrow whatever she needed from mother's collection because I believed her story about wanting to represent our family with dignity and grace at such an important social event. I believed her when she said she would rather not attend than wear something inappropriate. Believed her when she claimed she only wanted to do credit to the Chen family name. Believed her when she promised the bracelet would be returned immediately after the event and treasured always as a symbol of our growing bond as mother and daughter. But now I understand that this request was the first test of my willingness to be manipulated. The opening move in a chess game where Helena had already planned every subsequent attack while I was still trying to figure out the rules of engagement. And I realized that my eager compliance taught her exactly how to exploit my guilt and my desperate need for family harmony to systematically strip away my inheritance piece by piece over the coming years. She learned that I would sacrifice anything to avoid conflict, that I valued being seen as generous and accommodating more than protecting my own interests, that I could be manipulated through appeals to family loyalty and social responsibility because I was too naive to recognize the difference between genuine need and calculated exploitation. The knock comes on my door exactly as I remember it, Helena's soft voice calling my name with the perfect blend of hesitation and hope that made me feel important and needed in my previous life. But now I hear the false notes in her performance, and I understand that she has been rehearsing this moment, planning exactly what to say and how to present herself to maximize the chances that I will comply with her request without asking uncomfortable questions or setting boundaries that might interfere with her long-term strategy. Come in, I call, and I watch Helena enter my room with the same graceful movements and carefully arranged expression of vulnerable hope that I remember so clearly. Her designer dress chosen to suggest prosperity without ostentation, her makeup applied to enhance her natural beauty, while suggesting the slight fatigue of a woman who has been working tirelessly to adjust to her new role as wife and stepmother. Her posture conveying both confidence and humility in perfect balance. Sophia, darling, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, Helena begins. And I notice how she uses my name with calculated familiarity, not too intimate, but warm enough to suggest genuine affection. And I remember how flattered I felt in my previous life when she treated me like a daughter, rather than an obligation she had inherited through marriage. But this time, instead of immediately offering her my attention and assistance, I continue brushing my hair while watching her reflection in the mirror, letting the silence stretch until she has to fill it herself, and I see the slight tightening around her eyes that suggests she expected easier compliance with her implied request for my time and emotional energy. Actually, Helena, I am rather busy this morning, I say with cool politeness, using the formal distance of her first name instead of any familial title, and I watch her mask slip slightly as she realizes that the eager-to-please stepdaughter she has been cultivating is somehow different today, less accessible to her practiced manipulation techniques. Of course I don't want to impose, she says, but I can hear the frustration beneath her understanding tone, the slight edge that reveals how much she was counting on my predictable compliance with her unstated expectations. And I realize that in my previous life, I never made her work this hard for access to my cooperation and resources. What did you need? I asked directly, still not turning around to give her my full attention, still brushing my hair with deliberate slowness while she stands in my doorway like a supplicant, instead of the gracious stepmother bestowing her presence on a grateful daughter. Helena launches into her prepared speech about the charity gala and her need for appropriate jewelry. But this time I hear every calculated word, every carefully crafted emotional appeal, every manipulation technique designed to make me feel guilty for having inherited beautiful things, while she has to make do with whatever she brought to our family through marriage. And I understand that she has studied my psychology with the precision of a scientist mapping behavioral patterns for future exploitation. I'm sorry, but those pieces are family heirlooms, I say when she finishes her request, my voice steady and final, and I finally turn around to meet her eyes directly while she processes this unexpected resistance to what should have been a simple transaction in her master plan. The shock on Helena's face is worth every moment of this conversation, and I realize that my refusal has forced her to confront the possibility that her campaign of emotional manipulation might not proceed as smoothly as she anticipated, that the grieving daughter she expected to control through guilt and longing for maternal approval has somehow developed boundaries and self-preservation instincts that could complicate her strategy for systematic asset acquisition. I understand, Helena says finally, but her smile is strained and her eyes are calculating as she begins to formulate alternative approaches to achieving her objectives. And I know that this is only the beginning of our war, that she will escalate her tactics until she finds a way to break down my resistance and restore her access to the Chen family wealth that she has already mentally claimed as her own rightful inheritance. After Helena leaves my room, I immediately call David Zhang, my childhood friend and neighbor whose family's Zhang Enterprises has been partnering with Chen Company for decades. And when he answers the phone, I can hear the surprise and joy in his voice because in my previous timeline, I had already started distancing myself from him under Helena's influence, choosing to prioritize my new family relationships over old friendships that Helena suggested were holding me back from emotional growth and maturity. Sophia, I was just thinking about you, David says, and I can picture his face lighting up with that warm smile that I took for granted in my previous life, when I was too focused on winning Helena's approval to appreciate the steady loyalty of someone who had known me since childhood and never asked me to be anyone other than myself. I need to see you today, I tell him, and the urgency in my voice must convince him that this is important, because he immediately offers to come over or meet me wherever is convenient, without asking for explanations or demanding to know why I suddenly want his company after weeks of polite excuses and canceled plans. Within hours of my conversation with David, I am sitting in the private office of Master Chen Wei-ming, the most respected jewelry craftsman in the city, explaining that I need perfect replicas of my entire inheritance collection, created with absolute discretion and delivered within 2 weeks. And when he sees the photographs and certificates I have brought, his eyes widen with recognition of the historical significance and monetary value of the pieces that have been passed down through 4 generations of Chen women. Master Chen has created jewelry for my family before, including the custom engagement ring my father gave my mother. And he understands immediately that this request involves protecting family treasures from some unspecified threat that requires careful planning and flawless execution. These pieces tell the story of your family's journey through the 20th century, Master Chen says as he examines the photographs of my grandmother's emerald necklace, my great-grandmother's jade bracelet, my mother's diamond collection, and dozens of other items that represent not just monetary wealth but cultural heritage and emotional connections that cannot be replaced once lost. I will create replicas so perfect that only an expert gemologist with specialized equipment could detect the difference. But you must promise me that you are not planning to use these copies for fraud or deception that could bring dishonor to your family's reputation. I assure Master Chen that my intentions are purely protective, that I need to safeguard these irreplaceable heirlooms from people who see them only as financial assets to be liquidated rather than family legacy to be preserved. And he agrees to undertake the project with the understanding that his work will serve to protect rather than exploit the cultural treasures that represent my mother's memory and my grandmother's sacrifice during wartime when jewelry often meant the difference between survival and starvation for families fleeing political upheaval. David accompanies me to several meetings with private investigators, lawyers, and financial experts as we begin building a comprehensive case against Helena's systematic manipulation of my father and fraudulent management of family assets. And I am amazed by how much evidence David has already collected during the years when I dismissed his concerns as paranoia or jealousy. He shows me bank records that document suspicious transfers, property sales that happened without proper family consultation, forged signatures on legal documents, and a pattern of financial manipulation that becomes undeniable when viewed as a coordinated campaign rather than isolated incidents that could be explained by legitimate business necessities. I knew something was wrong when Helena started asking our accountant detailed questions about your family's trust fund structures and inheritance laws, David explains as we review boxes of documentation in his family's law firm conference room, surrounded by evidence that will eventually destroy Helena's carefully constructed facade of devoted wife and loving stepmother. No grieving widow needs that level of detail about estate planning unless she's positioning herself to manipulate the system for personal gain. And when I tried to warn your father, Helena convinced him that I was jealous of his happiness and trying to sabotage his new marriage. The replicas are delivered exactly on schedule, and Master Chen's work is so flawless that I have to check the certificates to remind myself which pieces are genuine and which are copies. And I realize that Helena will never suspect the switch unless she takes the jewelry for professional appraisal, which she is unlikely to do while she believes she is gradually convincing me to loan her family heirlooms for temporary use, rather than permanently transferring ownership. I carefully replace every piece in the family vault with its replica, documenting the process with photographs and video evidence that will prove the timeline of Helena's theft when the criminal case eventually comes to trial. David arranges for the genuine pieces to be stored in a private safety deposit box at a bank where Helena has no access or influence, with both of us listed as authorized users and detailed insurance coverage that will protect the collection even if Helena somehow discovers our strategy and attempts to destroy the evidence of her crimes through violence or intimidation. We also establish a trust fund that will preserve these pieces for future generations of Chen women, ensuring that my grandmother's sacrifices and my mother's love will be honored even if Helena succeeds in destroying everything else about our family's legacy. The research into Helena's background yields disturbing information that confirms David's worst suspicions about her true motivations for targeting my father, including evidence that she has done this before, that her previous husband's death was followed by mysterious financial irregularities and insurance claims that left his children from a first marriage with nothing, while Helena and Madison inherited everything. We discover that Helena spent months studying our family before orchestrating her chance meeting with my father, that she knew about my mother's death and our vulnerable emotional state, that she specifically chose to pursue a wealthy widower with a grieving daughter who could be manipulated through guilt and loneliness into cooperating with systematic asset stripping. She's not just a gold digger. David tells me as we review the private investigator's report on Helena's history of targeting wealthy widowers and systematically destroying their relationships with children from previous marriages. She's a professional predator who has refined her techniques through multiple successful campaigns. And she chose your family because your father's grief made him vulnerable, and your guilt made you controllable. And she planned this entire operation from the moment she heard about your mother's death. Over the following weeks, I carefully rebuild my relationship with Helena by pretending to feel guilty about my initial coldness and resistance to her requests for jewelry loans, apologizing for being selfish and inconsiderate during her attempts to integrate into our family and represent us appropriately at social functions. And I watch her relief and satisfaction as she believes she has successfully reestablished her psychological dominance over the naive daughter who briefly threatened to complicate her plans. I act increasingly distracted by social activities and romantic interests, particularly my renewed friendship with David Zhang, and I let Helena think that my focus on frivolous pursuits means I am paying less attention to family finances and business operations, giving her more freedom to accelerate her systematic asset appropriation. Helena begins borrowing pieces from my jewelry collection with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety, starting with items for specific social events, but gradually keeping pieces for longer periods and eventually treating my mother's jewelry as her personal collection that she graciously allows me to access when I specifically request something for my own use. Madison starts wearing my mother's pearl earrings to business meetings, my grandmother's diamond brooch to charity lunches, my great-grandmother's jade bracelet to society weddings, and I document every instance with photographs that will eventually prove the systematic nature of their theft rather than innocent borrowing for temporary occasions. I pretend not to notice when Helena fails to return pieces after the events where she claimed she needed them, acting like the scattered daughter who is too focused on her own social life to keep track of material possessions. And I watch Helena's confidence grow as she believes she has successfully trained me to accept the gradual transfer of my inheritance into her daughter's possession without complaint or resistance. The fake jewelry performs exactly as Master Chen promised, looking identical to the original pieces in casual settings, while Helena and Madison wear them to events where their beauty and apparent value enhance their social status and perceived wealth among the city's elite families. David and I begin appearing together at public events where Helena and Madison are also present, and I enjoy watching Helena's frustration as she realizes that David's family connections and business success make him a more suitable romantic partner for me than any of the men she had planned to introduce as potential husbands, who would be more easily controlled and manipulated to serve her interests. Helena had clearly intended to manage my eventual marriage as carefully as she managed every other aspect of my life, choosing a spouse who would either be grateful enough or weak enough to cooperate with her continued control over Chen family assets, even after father's death. But David Zhang represents everything Helena fears: old family wealth that doesn't need Chen money, business independence that can't be manipulated through financial pressure, and, most dangerous of all, childhood loyalty that predates Helena's arrival in my life and can't be undermined through the usual techniques of gossip and character assassination that she has used to isolate me from other potential allies and supporters. I see Helena calculating how to sabotage my relationship with David, but she is constrained by his family's business partnership with ours and the social standing that makes direct attacks risky for her own reputation and position. Helena accelerates her timeline for asset liquidation, becoming greedier and more careless as she attempts to convert as much of my inheritance as possible into liquid assets before I marry David, and potentially gain access to independent legal and financial advice that could expose her fraud. She begins pressuring father to make additional changes to estate planning documents, suggesting that it would be more efficient and tax advantaged to consolidate family wealth under her management rather than maintaining separate trusts and accounts that create unnecessary complexity and administrative burden. I pretend to be increasingly focused on wedding planning and romantic concerns, acting like the typical young woman who is too distracted by love to pay attention to boring financial details, and Helena relaxes her guard as she believes she has successfully reduced me to the manageable stereotype of the frivolous daughter whose marriage will remove her as an obstacle to Helena's complete control over Chen family resources. Madison begins making comments about how she will redecorate the family mansion after she inherits it, how she will modernize the business operations when she takes over Chen Enterprises, how she plans to sell various properties and investments that she considers outdated or inefficient compared to contemporary wealth management strategies. The auction house contact that Helena has been cultivating agrees to handle a major sale of family jewelry that has been sitting in storage unused for years. And I learn about the planned auction through David's connections in the art and antiques community, where news of significant estate sales travels quickly among collectors and dealers who specialize in Asian family treasures and historical pieces. Helena has represented the sale as downsizing by a family that wants to liquidate assets for investment diversification, claiming that the Chen family has decided to sell jewelry that has sentimental value but limited practical use in order to fund business expansion and charitable giving that better reflects our contemporary values and priorities. The charity gala, where Helena plans to debut several of my most valuable pieces, takes place at the Grand Ballroom of the Harmony Hotel, with 500 of the city's most prominent social and business leaders in attendance, including international collectors, museum curators, and society journalists who document every detail of such events for publications that reach influential readers throughout Asia and beyond. Helena has chosen this venue specifically because she knows the media coverage will establish her social credentials and Madison's position as an emerging force in the city's cultural scene, with photographs and articles that will cement their transformation from social climbers into established members of the elite community that controls business and political networks throughout the region. David ensures that several expert gemologists and jewelry historians are present at the gala, ostensibly as part of his family's cultural foundation work, but actually positioned to observe and potentially evaluate any significant pieces that might be displayed during the evening's festivities. And I watch from across the ballroom as Helena proudly wears my mother's emerald necklace, while Madison displays my grandmother's diamond bracelet, both of them glowing with satisfaction as other guests compliment their exquisite taste and obvious prosperity. The irony of watching them receive praise for wearing my family's heritage while I stand nearby in simpler jewelry that actually belongs to me creates a surreal atmosphere where I feel like I'm attending my own funeral while the mourners celebrate their inheritance of my possessions. Helena has arranged for several pieces to be included in the evening's charity auction, claiming that the Chen family wants to contribute something meaningful to support the children's hospital that benefited my mother during her final illness. And I realize that she has crafted a narrative that makes her appear generous and community-minded, while actually profiting from the sale of stolen jewelry that she has no legal right to dispose of regardless of her marriage to my father. The auction catalog describes the pieces as donated by the Chen family in memory of beloved wife and mother, and Helena has timed the announcement to maximize emotional impact and minimize the possibility that father will object or ask uncomfortable questions about the origin and ownership of the items being sold. The first sign of trouble comes when Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the internationally renowned gemologist who serves on several museum boards and frequently authenticates pieces for major auction houses, approaches Helena during the cocktail reception and asks to examine the emerald necklace more closely because she recognizes it from a scholarly article about wartime jewelry smuggling that featured photographs of pieces brought to safety by Chinese families fleeing political upheaval in the 1940s. Helena graciously allows the examination, confident that the craftsmanship and materials will pass any casual inspection. But I watch Dr. Morrison's expression change as she studies the stones under her jeweler's loupe and realizes that something is fundamentally wrong with what should be a museum-quality historical artifact. "These are very fine synthetic emeralds," Dr. Morrison announces to the small group that has gathered around Helena, her voice carrying clearly enough that nearby conversations pause, as people turn to understand why a respected expert sounds concerned about jewelry worn by one of the evening's prominent hostesses. The settings are authentic vintage work, but the stones themselves are modern laboratory creations. Very high quality, but definitely not the natural emeralds that would be expected in a piece of this apparent age and provenance. The silence that follows Dr. Morrison's pronouncement spreads through the ballroom like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, as guests who were admiring Helena's elegance and Madison's sophisticated style suddenly realize they are witnessing something far more dramatic than a typical charity gala. Something that involves questions of authenticity and possibly fraud among people they assumed were established members of their social circle. Helena's face goes through a fascinating transformation from confident hostess to confused victim to defensive accused party as she realizes that her carefully planned social triumph has become a public humiliation that will be discussed and analyzed by everyone who matters in their community for months or possibly years to come. That's impossible, Helena says, her voice rising slightly as she touches the necklace with trembling fingers. And I can see her mind racing through possible explanations that might salvage her reputation and social standing, while the ballroom full of witnesses watches her struggle to maintain composure under circumstances that she never anticipated or prepared for during her years of planning and execution. This necklace has been in the Chen family for generations. I would never wear anything that wasn't authentic. There must be some mistake in your evaluation. But Dr. Morrison is already examining Madison's bracelet with the same expert attention, and her frown deepens as she identifies additional inconsistencies between the apparent age of the settings and the modern characteristics of the diamonds, creating a pattern of synthetic stones and vintage settings that suggest systematic replacement rather than coincidental authentication errors. Other experts in the crowd move closer to observe the examination, and I realize that Helena's nightmare is just beginning as word spreads through the ballroom that the Chen family's jewelry collection may be comprised entirely of sophisticated forgeries rather than the priceless heirlooms that have established their reputation for cultural sophistication and inherited wealth. The charity auction is postponed when the other Chen family pieces are also identified as synthetic reproductions, and Helena finds herself surrounded by concerned officials who need to understand how items described as family heirlooms came to be revealed as modern replicas at such a public and well-documented event. The police are called discreetly to avoid creating additional scandal, but their presence becomes obvious as they begin taking statements from Helena, Madison, and the auction house representatives who accepted the pieces for sale based on Helena's representations about their authenticity and her authority to dispose of Chen family assets for charitable purposes. The investigation moves quickly once the police begin examining Helena's financial records and discover the pattern of systematic asset appropriation that David's research has already documented. And within 72 hours of the charity gala disaster, Helena is arrested for fraud, forgery, and theft, while Madison is detained as a potential accomplice, pending further investigation into her knowledge of and participation in the scheme to convert stolen jewelry into cash through auction sales and insurance claims. The media coverage is extensive and damaging, with photographs of Helena in handcuffs appearing alongside stories about the elaborate deception that fooled some of the city's most sophisticated social and business leaders for years, while systematically destroying a grieving family's heritage and financial security. Father's reaction to the revelation of Helena's true nature is complex and painful to witness, combining rage at the betrayal with guilt over his failure to protect me from manipulation and shame at his inability to recognize the predator who had been systematically destroying our family while he believed she was healing his loneliness and creating new happiness for all of us. The discovery that Helena may have contributed to Mother's death through deliberate stress and medical interference during her final illness sends Father into a fury that requires medical intervention and extended therapy to process the full scope of the psychological warfare that was conducted against our family for years, without our awareness or understanding. Helena's legal defense attempts to portray her as a victim of circumstance who was trying to protect the Chen family's assets during difficult economic times. But the evidence of systematic forgery and fraud is overwhelming, particularly when combined with testimony from her previous husband's children about similar patterns of asset stripping and manipulation that left them impoverished while Helena inherited everything through carefully orchestrated estate planning that isolated the natural heirs from their father's affections and financial resources. The prosecution presents a compelling case that Helena is a serial predator who targets wealthy widowers with vulnerable children, using grief and loneliness as weapons to gain control over family resources that she then systematically steals while maintaining the facade of devoted wife and loving stepmother. Madison's cooperation with the investigation reveals the extent of Helena's long-term planning and psychological manipulation, including evidence that Helena had been grooming her daughter from childhood to serve as a replacement for the natural heirs of wealthy men that Helena intended to marry and exploit, teaching Madison to mimic the interests and personalities of the daughters she was meant to replace, while learning to exploit their emotional vulnerabilities and social insecurities. Madison's testimony describes years of training in manipulation techniques, identity theft, and psychological warfare that Helena disguised as preparation for social success and financial security through strategic marriage and family infiltration. The financial recovery process reveals that Helena had been planning to liquidate virtually all Chen family assets within the next 2 years, converting everything into offshore accounts and international investments that would be difficult to trace or recover if her crimes were eventually discovered. And the intervention at the charity gala prevented the completion of a scheme that would have left father and me completely impoverished while Helena and Madison disappeared with millions of dollars that represented 4 generations of Chen family sacrifice and achievement. The genuine jewelry collection is returned from the safety deposit box where David and I stored it, and the insurance companies agree to cover the legal costs and investigative expenses associated with recovering stolen assets and prosecuting the perpetrators. Lucas Way's family issues a public statement distancing themselves from Madison and expressing regret for any association with Helena's criminal enterprise. And Lucas himself attempts to contact me through David to apologize for his role in the psychological warfare that Helena orchestrated against me. But I have no interest in rebuilding relationships with people who chose to believe Helena's lies, rather than trust their own knowledge of my character and family background. The social rehabilitation process is easier than expected because the community recognizes that we were victims of sophisticated fraud rather than participants in questionable activities, and the sympathy and support we receive helps Father begin to heal from the trauma of realizing how completely he was manipulated and betrayed. Helena's sentencing hearing draws significant media attention, and the judge's comments about the particularly cruel nature of crimes that exploit grief and family loyalty to destroy victims' inheritance and emotional security send a clear message that such predatory behavior will be punished with the full severity of the law. And Helena receives a 5-year prison sentence, while Madison gets 2 years in a minimum security facility with extensive community service requirements that will keep her occupied with constructive activities rather than planning additional schemes to exploit vulnerable families. The recovery of our family's assets and the exposure of Helena's crimes creates an opportunity for Father and me to rebuild our relationship and restore the Chen family's reputation and business operations, with David's family providing both financial support and strategic advice as we work to undo years of damage and implement new safeguards against future manipulation or exploitation by people who might target our wealth and social position. I take an active role in Chen Enterprises for the first time, bringing fresh perspectives and contemporary business strategies that complement Father's experience and industry knowledge, and together we transform the company into a more dynamic and profitable operation that honors our family's traditional values while embracing innovative approaches to international trade and investment. The scholarship fund we establish in Mother's memory becomes a meaningful way to channel our recovered wealth toward helping other families survive financial crises and educational challenges, particularly focusing on supporting children who have lost parents and need additional resources to achieve their academic and professional goals, despite the emotional and practical obstacles created by family tragedy. The fund's first recipients include several of Helena's previous victims' children, who had been left impoverished by her systematic asset stripping, but demonstrate remarkable resilience and determination to rebuild their lives, despite the trauma and financial devastation they experienced. David's proposal takes place in the family garden where we played as children, surrounded by the flowers that my mother planted and the trees that my grandmother tended. And when he presents the engagement ring that Master Chen created using stones from Mother's jewelry collection that Helena never discovered in her systematic inventory of family assets, I realize that some forms of love and loyalty are strong enough to survive even the most sophisticated attempts at manipulation and destruction. Our wedding ceremony becomes a celebration not just of our personal happiness, but of the triumph of genuine relationships over calculated exploitation, with Father walking me down the aisle while wearing grandfather's watch that Helena tried to sell but couldn't find because David had quietly arranged for its protection years before I understood the scope of the threat facing our family. The pregnancy announcement at our wedding reception represents the beginning of a new generation that will inherit not just material wealth, but also the knowledge and wisdom necessary to protect our family's legacy from future predators who might target our success and happiness for their own advancement. And I feel profoundly grateful that our children will grow up understanding the difference between people who love them for who they are and people who see them as resources to be exploited for personal gain. Helena's imprisonment ensures that she cannot interfere with our new beginning, but the lessons learned from her manipulation will guide our family's security and relationship decisions for generations to come. As I watch Helena through the courthouse window being led away in handcuffs, wearing the orange jumpsuit that will be her wardrobe for the next 5 years, I realize that the greatest revenge wasn't the public humiliation or the legal consequences, but simply living well and protecting those who truly matter. And now, as David places his hand over mine where our baby grows, I know that some people are worth 1,000 lifetimes of loyalty, while others aren't worth a single moment of grief. The final chapter of Helena's story becomes a cautionary tale that helps other families recognize and defend against similar predatory schemes. And our willingness to share our experience publicly contributes to law enforcement training programs and victim support networks that can identify and interrupt family exploitation before it reaches the devastating levels that nearly destroyed our heritage and happiness. The genuine relationships that survived Helena's attempts at destruction prove stronger and more valuable than any material wealth she could have stolen. And the future we build together honors both the sacrifices of previous generations and the potential of generations yet to come. Father's health improves dramatically once Helena's psychological manipulation ends, and his joy in becoming a grandfather motivates him to share more stories about our family's history and values, ensuring that our children will understand not just their inheritance, but also their responsibility to protect and preserve what has been entrusted to their care. The Chen family legacy continues not because we successfully defended our material wealth, but because we learned to value the relationships and principles that no amount of money can replace and no degree of manipulation can permanently destroy. In the end, Helena's greatest failure was not the exposure of her crimes or the loss of her freedom, but her inability to understand that the things worth stealing, love, loyalty, family bonds, and personal integrity, cannot be taken by force or acquired through deception, and the people who possess these treasures will always be richer than those who measure wealth only in terms of material assets and social position. Our rebirth becomes not just a return to life, but a transformation into people wise enough to recognize true value and strong enough to protect it against all who would seek to destroy what they cannot possess.